Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. I've spent my career trying to understand conflict, specifically mass atrocities, the carceral system, and starvation, and how we could end it. Back in the 90s, when I was a college student, there was this air of optimism. And it might sound crazy to say now, but we honestly believed we had solved world peace. The Cold War had ended and democracy had won. All we needed to do was silence the guns of war, prosecute those who committed atrocities, oversee multi-party elections, privatize economies, and voila, the world would be at peace. Needless to say, we were wrong, but hope is not lost. In each episode of Disrupting Peace, I speak with a scholar specializing in one obstacle to peace and an activist who is changing systems from the ground up. Together, we'll explore what worked, what didn't, and why we shouldn't give up. Each episode ends with collective dreaming about what it would take to create the world we hope for, or at least to get a whole lot closer. To kick off the season, I'm speaking with Sam Moyn and Mamello. Sam Moyn is professor of law and history at Yale Law School and co-host of Digging a Hole, the legal theory podcast. He's written several books that complicate key tenets of peacebuilding, including human rights, liberalism, economic equality, and the laws of war. And like me, Sam's another child of the Cold War who grew up in the era of peacebuilding. I'm also joined by Mamello, head of campaigns at the South Africa-based organization Open Secrets. Open Secrets holds the profiteers of economic crime, human rights abuses, and war to account. Mamello was 1 year old when Nelson Mandela was elected president in 1994, and grew up amidst massive political change in South Africa. In this conversation, we discuss what went wrong in the 90s and what it would take to turn things around by 2050. Let's get into it. Mamello, Sam, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Bridget.
I wanted to start off our conversation in that era of the 1990s to try to capture this sense of optimism and possibility in that era. Sam, if I have guessed your age correctly, you were in college then in 1990, right? Or at the end of high school?
Yeah, I think I started college in 1990, entered university in the fall of that year.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a multiple choice quiz to get us started, and then we'll go to the more serious work. Which of the below 1990s facts was most relevant to your life at the time? A, Wilson Phillips reached Billboard's #1 spot with their song Hold On. B, Margaret Thatcher resigned as as British Prime Minister. C, the Soviet Communist Party approves Mikhail Gorbachev's call for multi-party politics. Or, and I'm hoping this isn't it, D, the arrival of blonde highlights, frosted tips for men. So what describes the world of Sam Moyn in 1990?
It's definitely not D. I think it might be A. I do remember Wilson Phillips, and I'm sure I knew of B and C, but they didn't affect me as far as I knew, and I wasn't focused on them.
Were you aware, or do you remember being aware of sort of roughly the ending of the Cold War?
Sure. I mean, I think it was impossible to miss. The Cold War had defined our whole consciousness growing up, but that doesn't mean that, someone in high school cared that much compared to pop music or, failed romances or whatever.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 1997, 1998. I was in graduate school at Binghamton University. And I remember at that time, I was very much interested in what humanitarian interventions were, right? They had just popped up at the end of the Cold War. So you've got like Somalia intervention to stop starvation, to stop these warlords. There's another intervention in Haiti, and there was this intervention in Bosnia. And the idea that the U.S. government could use its power to help facilitate and protect people and advance human rights and democracy. Yeah, the optimism shifted for me after the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, where NATO forces bombed Serbia. And I remember hearing something from some Kosovars who were saying there's no way that NATO used depleted uranium weapons to bomb us because they were there to protect our rights and our democracy. And I remember thinking, well, those two things don't go together necessarily, right? When you fight to win a war, you fight to win a war. And doing it because of someone's human rights doesn't mean that you're not also bombing their farms, their bunkers, or leaving that waste, the environmental waste that war produces in their backyards. And I just remember at that point just thinking, we have to be able to parse out these different pieces of that mythic story of what was being accomplished.
For me personally, I lived very, very much Bridget's narrative because I believed in human rights. I went to the White House. I worked on the bombing of Serbia. I remember pinning above my desk there this New York Times op-ed that I helped, generate under the authorship of the then president, Bill Clinton, the headline of which was a just and necessary war. Bombing for humanity's sakes, it makes the world a better place. I believed it. And I think it wasn't so much the trajectory of Kosovo as the road from Kosovo to Iraq, where the same kinds of arguments were made about American power and its beneficence that disabused me and led me to not just rethink that event, but to kind of rethink the whole era and the Kool-Aid I had drunk and tried to drink other beverages since then.
Yeah, exactly. Mamello, I don't know how old you are.
Thank you.
So I don't know, but were you born in the 90s?
I was born 1 year before South Africa became a democracy officially. So I was born in the transition period.
Yeah, because in 1990, right? So the same year that Sam and I are jamming along to Wilson Phillips and vaguely aware that the world is changing, Nelson Mandela was also freed from prison that year after 27 and a half years in prison. Do you remember when you were growing up then in the 90s and then into the 2000s, the sense of optimism in South Africa?
Yeah, I really did. And I think my mother tells me a lot of stories, which I assume are lies. She tells me that at the first election, since I was only 1 year old at the first democratic election where Black people were allowed to vote, apparently I was on her back and I was there screaming, "Viva Nelson Mandela, viva." I don't know how true that is, but it's part of my origin story as to why I ended up working in this sector, is that I was there at the first election and I've always felt very passionate about democracy and peace. But yeah, I remember even as a child watching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and how present that was in our daily lives. Everything that we did at school, outside, what you saw on TV was all this information about the Rainbow Nation and the need to ensure that we all equal. For people like me who were born in that generation, those who are titled the Born Frees, it kind of defines how we see the world.
Mamello, you used a phrase there that I hadn't heard before, the born freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what that means in South Africa?
for many of those of us who grew up in that post-90s era, born after 1990, after the release of political prisoners like Nelson Mandela, I guess we were sold the notion that this is a different era. And because around us, we saw an explosion of democratization across the African continent, growing up, and now I guess seeing where we are, there is the feeling that a lot of that was myth making and societies were imagined rather than actually created and built, and that peace, rather, it takes more work than just saying that we are now in peace.
So I want to go back to something Mamello just said, though, about these myths. What were some of the key myths that allowed people to think this moment was going to be one where, the end of history, where liberal democracy had won? What were the key sort of ingredients for that story?
I think we were told that the problem was the Cold War. And once the bipolar world ended, there would be no more fundamental strife on the global level. What remained was, we were told, ancient ethnic hatreds. What was going on in Bosnia with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, dispute between the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda, it minimized what was left to do to achieve a kind of peaceful world, basically to get people to be less tribal and to be more enlightened and to give up their hatred. And it's not like that's false. That's a really important task. But the main thing was that it was a unipolar world.
Sam, for our listeners who might not know, can you explain what you mean by unipolarity?
Absolutely. It just means that there's one supreme power in the world. And in after 89, there's a shift from a bipolar world where there are two superpowers to a unipolar one in which there's just the United States. It wasn't a peaceful world yet. It was, if you like, a world with one country with unchecked power, and it used it. And of course, then there was the economic side. So that wasn't talked about, either American unipolarity or economic, neoliberalism. And instead, we just focus on hatred as like this blemish that was left.
We thought we knew. You have elections. You convert all economies to free market capitalist systems with limitations on what states could spend money on in order to get access to loans. And you pursue human rights, defined limited as political rights, and then prosecute the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that was the formula, right? I mean, all you had to do is bring the rest of the world sort of to this conclusion.
Yeah, bad guys defined as those who commit atrocity crimes. And that's a very narrow set of bad guys in our world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mamello, how did you see this from where you were?
I mean, I think for me, I would say the prosecuting the bad guys is where we completely failed in South Africa. And I think where a lot of people failed, as Sam says, the narrowness of how we defined atrocity crimes or crimes that were atrocious to us, I guess, is what is a problem of like not addressing systemic issues. I think oftentimes, and what we saw was that for the stability of economies or whatever was made to sound reasonable, is that people who say profited from crimes like apartheid or genocide or war crimes, people who actively enabled the selling of weapons to war zones, do not get prosecuted. The people who get prosecuted are like low-level foot soldier types. And what happens is the people that profited from those systems get embedded into the systems because they're seen as vital for sustainability, for the economy or whatever to survive. And then you just really entrench inequality. We define very narrowly who are our bad guys. And even when we have defined them properly, we see them as vital to the system or maintaining, I guess, our notions of what is peace, which are often very warped towards those who have power economically or otherwise. I think what was coming out a lot now about Jacob Zuma in particular is that he didn't just become corrupt in all of a sudden in 1990 or because someone gave him power. He was corrupt in the anti-apartheid movement. He was busy committing murders.
Right. And Jacob Zuma is the former president of South Africa.
Yes. I think we also enabled a lot of the authoritarianism that was happening in our neighboring countries because these were the people that helped the anti-apartheid struggle. But what that means is that then you're also embedding a culture of authoritarianism is okay, inequality is okay, as long as you can justify it by saying we fought for your freedom. And we have now very unaccountable figures who refuse to deeply interrogate themselves. And the examples that we could be using, or the people that we're told who are free, Europe and America, all kind of suck right now. All are going
Fair.
into deeply fascist tendencies. And there's not much we can learn from the democracies there. So where do we learn from? I don't know. Yeah.
I think all sort of major transition periods are treated as if there's a clean slate, like it's day zero.
Yeah.
And it's just not true.
And there needs to be a little bit of navel gazing a little bit. I really feel like there needed to be a moment where we sat and we're like, who are we? What are we? When we imagined our new community, I think we needed to also first ask, who are we? Rather than just imagining on top of something that didn't exist.
Yeah, before we leave this topic, Sam, I wanted to come back to you too in terms of navel gazing. 2001 is real, the attack, right? The 9/11 attack, and then all the wars that followed, all the surveillance, the constant bombing that followed. And those two time periods are often, their overlap is significant, but people often talk about sort of peace building, atrocity prevention, rule of law here, and then war making, global war, and terrorism here as if they weren't happening in an interwoven sort of U.S. fabric. And I'm curious how you think those two together.
I think what changed after 2001 was much less reality than our perception of it. The relation between the 90s and the period after was not one of break. It was more one of potential and reality. And then when we looked even more critically, we could see things like the United States was not, shuttering its military during the 1990s. Actually, it used it, and not just for humanitarian campaigns, but for early forms of counterterrorism, including targeted killings. It's not like America wasn't supporting Israeli counterterrorism, learning from it in the 1990s in ways that were going to prove fateful when the United States took on that mission after it was attacked. So it all became very murky.
Yeah, and I know from the area where I was working on atrocity preventions, it's in that time period, there is also a sense that we could call on government to engage on a human rights foreign policy in some areas and claim wins. But at the same time, then that limits how far people were willing to be critical of the same government that might be invading Iraq and overthrowing a government, not a good one, but they were overthrowing a government and committing atrocities.
Absolutely. I mean, that's well documented. But just to be a little, to be empathetic, if you believe in human rights and peace in the 90s, you immediately ask, well, who's going to institutionalize them? Yeah. And you look to the powerful actors and you kind of play into their hands by, in a sense, setting up the expectation that they will do good things, not the bad things that not only they've done in the past, but were doing at the time. And so there was a mistake made. And I think we go back to this very deep problem, which Mamello is talking about, which is, we don't yet envision the agents of transformation. And so we look to the wrong people who are tarnished by their own past acts. And in a sense, haste was the mistake that was made without envisioning a slow process of change by more credible agents.
Yeah. Mamello, I do want to turn to you to talk about Open Secrets. I mean, it was created to deal with some of the legacies of apartheid that still structure South Africa and were unaddressed in the transition. So how are you guys trying to grapple with doing things differently?
A myth that is common now is that corruption is a post-apartheid issue and that it's something that was born from the new government. And we try deliberately to disrupt that narrative. In our work on apartheid banks and apartheid guns and money, we looked at the archives, over 400,000 archival documents, really going through what the apartheid government failed to destroy. And we were able to piece together really a global network of people who enabled and profited from the apartheid system, from corporations in France, and also the banks, Belgian banks, Luxembourg banks. And we really try to shine the light on those kinds of actors to look at the fact that these aren't countries with clean hands, the France, Britain, United States in particular. These are all not just profiteers of the apartheid system, but they helped corrupt that system and helped enable it. And these are supposedly the same people who we look to now to lead us in creating our financial systems, our economy, and these are the people who were supposedly the leaders in human rights. But they didn't care when they were propping up a state that was fundamentally corrupt in moral ways and financial and economic ways. And that has played out in the fact that when we look at corruption now, we still see those very same actors. What happens here is not just a story about here. At one point, we can shine the light and tell the truth about what's happening in South Africa, but really, the global financial system inherently rewards those who seek to profit from abuses elsewhere. And to really change that, we need to challenge firstly the narratives, and also we're going to need multilateral organizing.
So I want to move us into our sort of third part of the interview, which is thinking into the future. So the 1990s are already 3 decades in the past. If we think another 30 years into the future, imagine we've achieved world peace in 2050. Or if we can't quite go that far, imagine that we've at least created a much more peaceful world. Paint me a picture of how we got there. Mamello, let's start with you.
And I'm overwhelmed. When you sent the question, I was like, oh no. I only know how to identify problems, not solutions.
Okay, Mamello, one thing that would make maybe not global peace, but let's say life in South Africa, are there things that should be, if there's a political party that addressed XYZ?
I'd definitely not be a political party for me. That's where I don't think solutions happen. I think for me, my biggest thing, I would like to see some accountability. And I don't necessarily want everyone to go to jail. I do think, however, that we need to redistribute the resources in South Africa. I live in Cape Town and everywhere it looks wealthy. You can see all the land and you're like, why is this not being shared with everyone? And it's accountability for the fact that a lot of companies in South Africa profit off of human rights abuses or war crimes in other African countries. Ending those systems and making sure that there's reparations for people, social protections for those who are marginalized, social protections for them are not charity. If anything, they're justice. So yeah, I want justice and accountability. But again, I'm not saying put everyone in jail, because jail helps no one.
Yeah, as someone who comes from a country that incarcerates a lot,
Yeah.
generally it ends up being a system that keeps corrupt systems in place and puts individuals, and in the US, obviously largely minorities, behind bars and protects the system.
Yeah.
Sam, so for you, we've got 30 years. We've done better. We're looking back and we say, great, we did. And what did we do? What did we do to get us to a better place?
First, I'm just going to say in passing, I'm not an activist, but I've kind of soured on like concepts like accountability and truth seeking, because to me, what really matters is disempowering those who shouldn't have power rather than like punishing them or getting them to pay for their crimes or transgressions. I mean, and then empowering those who deserve power. With truth, like there are a lot of truths, and I think people know, in a sense, a lot of what's going on and who's ruling others in our world. And it's just that, like, they haven't been convinced to change it. So, second comment, I think, as much as I want to complain about the 90s, I think we should just remember things could get worse. There have been worse eras, at least when it comes to war and peace. And so, above all, we want to, defend our gains and figure out how to extend them. So then, third, I want to think about in 30 years that first we avoided a new Cold War. If we don't want bipolar strife between America and China and all of the countries that follow each or get caught up in the fracas, we also should think critically about like wanting American dominance back. Like when you look at what's happening in Israel-Palestine right now, the heroes have been, not transatlantic states, but global South states that have been willing to, tell their truth and imagine other possibilities. And, America's been like out of place in that discussion of how we could build peace in just that one little place. And so more players, more multipolarity could have a lot of risks, but a lot of opportunities for doing even better than we did in the period since 1989 or even 1945.
Yeah, one of those heroes has been South Africa, which has filed a case of genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice.
It's totally amazing.
Thank you. Okay, so Peace 2050 will continue to be based on critically learning from the examples of the past, not thinking that you start over at any given moment, adding some economic equality and empowerment, deepen democracy rather than implement a formulaic version of it, and avoid war.
Yes. Yes. Was that your answer?
That's my summary of your answers.
I'm looking for your answer now. How do we get to substantive peace?
Yeah. I think one of the big one for me as someone who's coming from the United States is very intensively to demilitarize our foreign policy, is to back away from thinking that because we can or we have the capacity to use military around the world, that it is the right thing to do. To get away from that good guy, bad guy and militarization to a more peaceful policy, I think would be very helpful. I also think, Mamello, I'm thinking about your work. I think more international solidarity movements on big issues that are already globalized or internationalized and are instead treated as if, like you said, corruption, like as if that is something that lives in South Africa or it lives in Kenya or in Mexico or whatever, when so much of the systems that enable it to continue are ones that we share as well. And so working together across those international lines to create stronger solidarity movements. That's where it starts.
That's a great place to start.
Well, hopefully we can work together in the future.
Yes, we're building a solidarity movement right now.
Exactly. And Sam, you do teach in a program that has some influence. So keep attacking your students, challenging them.
Will do.
Thank you. We appreciate it on behalf of all of us for that philanthropic endeavor that you are a part of. But overall, I really want to thank both of you, Sam, Mamello, for joining me on this first episode of Disrupting Peace.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
A few things struck me about this conversation. First was the emphasis that both Sam and Mamello placed on the fact that the slate is never clean. Political transitions require critically engaging with the conditions we inherit, not myth-making. Second was how Sam stressed the perils of embracing military power as a force for good. And another piece was Mamello's call to challenge economic inequality. The idea that you could have democracy without increasing economic equality was really put to the test in post-apartheid South Africa. Finally, I think a really important thing that went wrong in the 90s was the idea that you could transition from authoritarian regimes or conflict to democracy in a series of shortcuts. Quick, hold elections, entirely change economies in a year or two. Those were all shortcuts to what I think remains a really positive goal, which is democracy and democratic debate. But you can't get there without nurturing a unique democratic discourse and discussion about what a population needs and what they want. Thanks for listening to episode 1 of Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Mamello and Open Secrets at opensecrets.org.za. And you can follow Sam Moyn on X at Samuel Moyn. That's Moyn. Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. The show's produced by myself and Emily Shaw. Recording assistance by Jacob Winnick, with mixing by Asia Simpson and Jacob Winnick as well. Marketing and social media by Kelsey Henquinet. Show artwork by Simon Fung. Special thanks to Jeremy Helton, my colleagues, Lisa Avery, B. Arneson, and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio, including Kimberly Lynn Ferrero-Arnias and Miles Donovan. Find out more about the World Peace Foundation at worldpeacefoundation.org. Follow us on X at WorldPeaceFDTN, all one word. That's WorldPeaceFDTN. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we're diving deep into the military-industrial complex, exploring what it will take to rein in both nuclear and conventional weapons on a global scale.
We're at the highest risk of use of nuclear weapons right now that we've seen since the Cold War. And so this treaty does not pretend that everything is fine in the world, but it is a really instrumental tool in and of itself on this longer pathway to the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.